Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari. This is Great Big History Podcast, and this is episode 2 of our history from 1450 till, well, almost yesterday. On the turning away, Ming China retreats from the world. So, even though we're from 1450, we have to start earlier. In the 1220s, the Mongols invaded China, and they used terrorism to rule it. 30 million people by the end of Mongol rule were dead. Cities were destroyed. The culture was ripped up. It was a trauma. China was absorbed into someone else's empire, and that was a humiliation. For its thousands of years of existence, China may have broken up, it may have been weak, but it was its own country, its own empire. And what it did was expand and absorb other smaller cultures and peoples on its borders. But now, under the Mongols, they were one part of a much more global empire. Persian Muslims were brought in to run the government, because Kublai Khan could not trust Chinese to run the government. He was the invader. So he brought in what were called Persians. They were Muslims from Central Asia and from the Middle East. And they were going to be loyal. They got paid very well. And the idea was they would be loyal to the Mongol emperor. The Mongols forced exportations of Chinese goods, which created money for the Mongols. So, what are the Mongols doing? They're looting China and then looting it more to make it pay. What was the reaction to this? Well, for Kublai Khan's time was to hide, to stay out of the way. But as time went on, and the Mongol rulers were not as good or as powerful or as legitimate as Kublai Khan was, we start to get activists. Hung Wu was a peasant turned an activist, and he was part of a movement that wanted to make China Chinese again, and a nationalism. He wanted to empower the peasantry, who he saw as the real Chinese. See, too many of the elites, the merchants, the mandarins, the educated elites, made deals with the Mongols. Okay, they couldn't have real power, but they had things the Mongols needed. They could be a local governor somewhere. Like the national government, that's going to be run by the Persians. That's going to be run by the Mongols. But somewhere in the far south, a small town, well, now that little local mayor, that little local governor, he gets appointed by the Mongolian emperor. And maybe that would have never have happened before under a Chinese emperor. And so Hung Wu dislikes all of these elites who are making deals with the Mongols. He sees the peasantry, and he was a peasant himself, as real Chinese. Now, we're going to see this when we get to Mao as well. And so the idea was to not only get rid of the Mongols, but get rid of the other foreign elites as well. It is a reactionary, conservative policy. There's a problem, though. The Chinese haven't run China for about 100 years. They have no practical experience anymore. Theoretical and educational, philosophical, sure, but no practical experience running a gigantic country of roughly, 300 million people? The Mongols run Central Asia plus the Middle East. China would have no friends. So while Hung Wu leads a group of angry Chinese nationalists and conservatives who want to make China Chinese again and go back to the past. The problem is the world has left China behind. How do you do it practically? Well, the first thing is you can't do anything as long as the Mongols are strong. But what happens over time is you get Yuan, which is the Mongol dynasty, military decline, and the beginnings of economic failure. And once you get that, the Mongols don't seem so scary anymore. The Mongols don't seem so scary anymore. And that allows people to revolt. That allows people to protest. That allows people to stop paying their taxes, thinking, well, we'll see if something happens. They're not scared anymore. Whereas under Kublai Khan, you'd be worried that if you got out of line, a Mongolian platoon or brigade might show up and just burn your town to the ground. Loot the city if you didn't pay your taxes. Now, you're 100 years later, and these Mongols have been running Central Asia for 100 years. They're not the conquerors. They're not Genghis Khan anymore. Now, Tamerlane in 1400 is way out there in the West, in Persia and Uzbekistan, and he's going to be creating a new Mongol state, and he's going to attack India. But one, we're a little bit away from that, and two, that's 6,000 miles away. That's not in China. The Mongol emperors in China have gotten kind of fat, lazy. They like Chinese culture. They're speaking Chinese. They're not really Mongolian anymore. But what happens is, so since they're not scary, you get a revolt, and Hung Wu ends up as one of the leaders and wins. This peasant revolt wins, and they create the Ming dynasty. So the goals of this new Ming dynasty were threefold, and they're all based on the trauma of what happened from the Mongols. First, kick the Mongols out of China. So that means wars on the borders. It's to push them as far away from the borders of China, from the central cities as possible. To push them out. Yeah, we overthrew them in the government, but now we have to kick them out. Get rid of them. 2, tell other nations that China is free, open for business, that we're not part of the Mongolian Empire anymore. And 3, make it so the Mongols don't come back. So kick them out, make it so they can't come back, and tell other people, we beat the Mongols. China is back, baby. What that meant was Hung Wu needed to keep the Persian officials. Hung Wu was going to need to build a navy to travel to allies in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. These are liberal actions, a change of policy, a change of history, an embrace of diversity in order to interact with the world. Do Mandarin philosophers know where India is? Nope. Or what about Islam in the Middle East? Nope. They have any of those kind of maps? Nope. The Persians do, though. They're worldly. They literally crossed the 6,000 miles of Eurasia to go from Persia and Central Asia to East Asia. And so, despite being reactionary, despite being very conservative, Hongwu and the early Ming realize that for the Ming to be successful, they can't break with the present in order to recreate the past. And that's going to be a big issue later in this class for other countries, other cultures. Can you go back? And Hongwu says, we can't. To accomplish what we want, to get rid of the Mongols, we're going to have to use the advantages we got. The Yongle Emperor, the third emperor, is the apex of this liberal policy. He married the daughter of a leading Ming general to make an ally of the army. Then he overthrew his nephew, who was the second emperor, the son of Hongwu, in a brief civil war. And what he did was try to accomplish those three goals simultaneously. A military campaign against the Mongols in the north and the northwest, and the employment of Zheng Ho, which in English is spelled Z-H-E-N-G, and Ho, which is H-E in English. He is a 7-foot-tall Persian Muslim eunuch. Seven feet tall in a world where the average Chinese person is about 5'2", 5'3". And Zheng Ho is going to take 7 voyages to tell nations China is free. And maybe make trade alliances. Maybe bring in money. Maybe. But either way, it's a victory because he goes and he goes. He goes to Vietnam. He goes to Malacca. He goes to Indonesia, to India, to the Middle East, to Africa. And the military campaigns north of Beijing, Beijing had been a border town, pushed further north, to the north and the northwest. The Yongle Emperor is stunningly successful. Ming power grows, and the world is made aware of it. Zheng Ho's voyages from 1405 to 1433 included as many as 300 ships, 60 treasure ships, which were even bigger. It had 30,000 sailors, Marines, and scientists. Remember, Columbus, even in his biggest expeditions, maybe had 1,000 sailors and soldiers with him in the second or the third trip. He did nothing compared to this. There's a nice little display in a Chinese mall of one of Zheng Ho's treasure ships versus the Santa Maria, the biggest of Columbus's ships. The treasure ships could have easily have sailed. They were like aircraft carriers. They could easily have crossed the Pacific and discovered California. This is a massive expense, but also an industrial boom. Think of all the carpenters who have to be hired, all the sail makers, all the pencil makers just to make something to write with, the pen, the ink, right? The pillows. Everything that has to be made for these ships was government investment in the economy equaled growth. After years, after a century of the Mongols growing the economy for themselves, now the economy is growing for the mass of people. China is getting richer. They could have easily have discovered America. They reach India, the Persian Gulf, and Africa. Even bringing back giraffes. Ming China is the first global naval power since the Byzantines. So for about 500 years. This is a success of the Persian anti-Confucian liberal faction. They have built the ships, helped the economy, made alliances, or at least introduced the Chinese emperor, the Mongol emperor, to other places. In theory, opening up trade routes, perhaps, pushed back the Mongols in the north. In every way, a Ming emperor, a Chinese emperor, plus the Persian anti-Confucian liberals have won. The problem is that it is expensive. And what did it accomplish? Not much. Like, the Mongols had been defeated, and they pushed back. Okay, but they were already in the north. All right. We had already kicked them out of China proper. There is not a big boom in naval trade from Indonesia or the Philippines or India or the Middle East. They remain mostly tied to land trade. Just the Mongols are still kind of in charge of Central Asia and have cut, Ming China kind of off. But the Ming are also like, I don't know if we want to trade and make the Mongols richer, because if we trade to Europe, the Mongols are going to get a cut of that because it has to go through their lands, their imperial lands in Central Asia. So the problem is this is extremely expensive, and it didn't make a lot of money back. There's also all those mandarins who are like, hey, what about making China Chinese again? Why do you have all these Persians and all these Muslims? So we get a turning away from the liberal faction. After the Mongol emperor's death, it's becoming hard to replace Persian ministers. How do you get them? Where do you get them from? Plus, there's safety now. And emperors start looking into poetry rather than artillery. The Mongol emperor went to war with his army. His successors really don't. And what we see is the success of the Chinese Confucian mandarins. After the Mongol emperor's death, we get more conservative, more safe emperors who don't have to worry too much about the Mongols. And they look at the expense of the Navy and go, I could spend that money on myself. So, once the Mongol emperor dies, once Zheng He dies, the Chinese political culture turns conservative, turns inward. The army declines. The ships are literally burned and left to rot. Laws are passed to end oceanic trade. See, here's the problem. China doesn't need the world. Why do we want to communicate with them? Why do we want to trade with them? Why do we want to connect with them? They hurt us. Why do we want their immigrants to be elites? Why do we want their money? We're fine without them. China can do it on its own. And so from the 1450s, notice, we're like 3 generations in to the Ming. And for the next 200 years, so for the next 10 generations, the Ming will survive, but increasingly turn to isolation. And this is doubled by the 8th emperor. The 8th emperor, now remember the Mongol emperor was the 3rd, so we've had a bunch of conservatives after him. And the 8th is tired. He's like, I'm going to be like the Mongol emperor. I'm going to be like Hung Wu. I'm going to be a military leader. I'm not going to be stuck in my little palace, playing my little poetry games and all. I'm going to prove my manliness. I'm going to lead an army. And I'm going to go north versus the Mongols and these other forest nomads, the Manchus. I'm going to beat them up. I'm going to push them farther away. I'm going to claim the North. All right? Remember, China expands, right? China has always been expanding. Okay. But there's a problem. And the problem is very clear. We've had a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, and a seventh emperor, and no military victories. We have watched the Navy been burned. We have watched the Army decline from lack of investment because nobody was a warlike emperor. So now you've got a war emperor without any of the stuff he needs. No logistical train, no experienced officer corps, no industrial base to make weapons. And so it's a complete and utter disaster. It's so bad, the emperor gets captured. Do you know how bad it is for the emperor to be captured by Mongols? And this ensues a panic that this can never happen again. Now, what I think happens, and I could be wrong, but I think what happens is they put a new emperor. They basically consider this emperor dead. They put a new emperor on the throne. And what the Mongols eventually do is they try to get blackmail. And then when that doesn't come in, they kind of release this emperor to like cause havoc, to like show up and be like, I'm the old emperor, and hope the army would go to him and kind of just cause chaos. This happens in the Byzantine Empire a couple times with the Turks, or even the Persians maybe, where the enemy captures a Byzantine emperor, tries to blackmail him back, and then when that doesn't work, just releases him to kind of cause havoc by raising an army out of loyalists who don't know he's no longer the emperor, because news travels slowly in this world. So when the emperor shows up and goes, "Hey, I'm the emperor," people don't necessarily know who the real emperor is. He looks shiny in his silk robes. I guess he's the emperor. So, but this is panic. And so what we get is an even greater conservatism. China is going to cut itself off from the world. They're going to build the Great Wall as a permanent border between China and the nomads. So they're going to build the wall, and what that does is it creates a border. It says China is south of this, and we don't care what's north of it. North of it is something else, right? But remember what that does. China expands. Not anymore, it's not. Plus, there's the Forbidden City in Beijing, which is a city within a city to protect the emperor. Because if the Mongols, Beijing is so far north that it's obviously the first place the Mongols or later the Manchus would attack if they come from the north, right? And that's its benefit. You want the emperor in the north near where the wars are happening. If the emperor is a military leader, right? He needs to be near his armies. Makes complete sense. The problem is what happens if the emperor gets captured? What happens if the Mongols or Manchus come down and lay siege to that city and then break into it, break through the walls? What happens if they kill or capture the emperor? And so what the Forbidden City is a garrison. It's a fortress. It's a city within the city. So that even if the Mongols lay siege to Beijing and break through the walls, they'll storm through the city. They'll loot, they'll plunder, they'll kill, they'll murder, and then they'll hit another set of walls, which is going to take them months and months and months to get through, just like the first set of walls took months and months. And the hope is that an army from the south, an army from Nanjing, from Shanghai, from the farmlands of the south will come in that time and rescue the emperor. It makes complete sense from a military point of view. Washington, D.C. was turned into a fortress city during the Civil War. There were forts everywhere around Washington, D.C. Why? Because if one of the Confederate armies broke through and got to Washington, D.C., it's one thing for them to go around and burn people's houses and hotels and stuff. It's a whole nother thing for the Confederates to capture Abraham Lincoln, capture Congress. And so they built forts all around Washington, D.C. So that even if the Southern, and this will happen in 1864 or early in 65, right? And a cavalry army breaks through in the Shenandoah, gets up to Washington, and does what? Can't do anything. They don't have the artillery needed to invest one fort and then another fort and then another fort. Those are going to take months. So they turned around and left. But what this also does is seal in. China is cut off from the northern and western borders. It's cut off from its trade routes to the Middle East, to India. The emperor is cut off from the people. People don't see him anymore. He's in the Forbidden City. And it's the Forbidden City. You can't go there and see him. So tell me, how much does the emperor know what's going on? How much connection does he have to ordinary people? How much does he care? And you can see the problem. So the results of Ming isolation is that the emperors were shut off from the people. And so what do they do with their time? They do pleasures and parties. They do fun stuff. They have nothing else to do. They're not military leaders. They're not cultural leaders. They're shut away. So they go into pleasures, a harem, parties. In reality, they are no longer important. The vibes are important. And even if you had good advisors who want to come in and tell an emperor, you can run China. There's things that need to be they get fired. They're too independent. And if you get some generals or officers or mayors or governors somewhere in the far south or in the west who are like, well, I'm going to take it upon myself, they get fired for being too independent. So what happens is government industries wither and then shut down. The economy starts to weaken. Now, not only that, but because China is the great economic engine of the world, it's also weakening the economies of Central Asia, of Northern India, of the Middle East, of the Turks. Everyone on the old Silk Road is getting poorer along with China. We're going to see how that affects everyone. The Ottoman Turks are the most dramatic change in that, because we have maps of what happens. But Central Asia goes from being one of the wealthiest parts of the world for almost all of human history to now, how many of you want to go to Uzbekistan? How many of you are planning a trip to Samarkand? Right? Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a rich country in the Middle Ages. In the ancient world, it's the birthplace of empires. Now there's a book that's like, oh, that's where empires go to die. No empire died in Afghanistan. Empires were born in Afghanistan. But it's a good title for a book. And if you never look older than like 1989, you don't have to worry about actually being right. So that's why we don't use AI, ladies and gentlemen. We do our own readings. History is older than 1989. So Ming government industry withers. It shuts down. The economy starts to weaken. The emperor, well, with less money, what is the emperor going to spend money on? He's going to spend money on himself. So he keeps spending money on his pleasures, which means the army decays even further without investments. Farmers are not helped when the inevitable droughts or floods happen. The hurricanes come in, the cyclones come in. There's no money to help them. But remember, the emperor's not going to stop spending money on himself. So what you get is a peasant revolt in the 1600s, 1620s, 1630s. And then into the open in the 1640s. The peasants open the wall and bring in Manchu, Mongol, Turkish invaders. See, now if you look at the map, if you're watching the video, there's the heavy yellow. The very heavy yellow. That's China. The lighter, paler yellow all along the western and northern border, that's the empire of the Manchus. See, once they built the wall and shut off their connection north of the wall to the Mongols, that was supposed to protect them. But what it did was stop China from intervening north of the wall. So what happened is a new empire arose, the empire of the Manchus. The Manchus were a nomadic people in Manchuria in the northeast, and they started picking up gunpowder, picking up guns, beating up on the Mongols, and then allying with them, then going further. And they couldn't invade China because of the Great Wall, so they went around, and they conquered all of Central Asia. They went around China, which the Chinese emperors didn't care about. Why? Because they weren't trading with the West. They didn't care. They had turned insular. And so the Ming actually created the very thing that Hung Wu and the Yongle emperor wanted to prevent. The later Ming, by becoming less diverse, by becoming more insular, by becoming more conservative, actually brought about their own destruction. Because what happened is the peasants opened the walls. The Great Wall is not solid. The Great Wall has plenty of trading gates through it. And what they did was just open them up and let the Manchus, Mongols invade. And the Qing dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, comes sweeping through, takes over. The Ming flee to, of all places, Taiwan, where they set up an empire in exile. That will be familiar when we get to 1947 and today. The Qing dynasty is going to last 300 years, roughly 300 years. They are foreigners, which is the nightmare of China. Remember, when the Mongols came through, bad things happened. But the Manchus are not the Mongols. Yes, they have Mongol allies and they have Turkish allies, but the Manchus are clearly in charge, and they are not the Mongols. They united the tribes north and west of the Great Wall, as I explained. They took over China, but then ran it as Confucian emperors. When you look at the picture I have on the screen, does that look like a foreign emperor to you or a Chinese emperor to you? He's dressed like a Chinese emperor, but he's not. He's a Manchurian horseman. He's a Manchurian horse lord of the nomads. He is the nightmare of China. For 5,000 years, China has fought with these nomadic horse peoples. Won sometimes, lost a lot. But that is the great worry of the farmers and the merchants of coastal China, that these people were going to win. And when they won for the Mongols, it was a disaster. And now they're back. But what did the Qin do? What did the Manchus do? They hired the Mandarins. They invested in Chinese art, poetry, science. They opened up the land routes to the north and the west, emphasizing a strong external trade. This is where the porcelain comes from. If you go to a museum and you see Chinese porcelain, it's from this period. The late Ming, early Qing, they opened it up to bring in silver, to bring in money. They took over China but ran it like Confucian emperors. Qianlong's reign was a golden age. probably the first since the Mongol emperor. He rules for 88 years, and it is a time of stability, wealth, peace, education, a massive empire uniting China with the nomads. It is actually the accomplishment of what mandarins had wanted since the since the first emperor took over, and probably even before the first emperor, that if someone was going to run East Asia, it was going to be Mandarin China allied with the nomads instead of fighting against them. And it is the Qin that accomplish it. So what's the problem? Why doesn't the Qing dynasty exist today? Why does it fall apart? And the answer is, ironically, things were too good. Decadence. Again, just like the Ming. Decadence. There were no wars. There's lots of money. And you get lazy emperors after Qianlong. After Qianlong, you get these lazy emperors who seek pleasures. They have nothing to spend money on except themselves. They don't want to invade Japan. They already are allied with Korea. Anytime they try to invade Vietnam, they lose. So why do that? There's no navy, which means the coast isn't protected. Which means that space is going to be filled. And who is it going to be filled by? Japanese pirates. Always Japanese pirates. When in doubt, in East Asia, there are Japanese pirates. If you are sailing on the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea, the Pacific, and you see a boat on the horizon, it's most likely Japanese pirates. But also, the Portuguese and then the Dutch are showing up from Europe. And they're bringing bigger boats with cannon on them, with big guns. That's not so much the Portuguese. The Portuguese are going to show up. They're going to have cannon. They're going to have good-sized boats, right? They're impressive when they show up. But there's also the first. When the Dutch show up, that's a real navy showing up. When the Dutch East India Company starts showing up, that's a real navy in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Those are big guns, big boats that could win naval battles in any ocean against any other navy. I mean, this is my period. This is the 1650s. This is my period. This is my period. I know how powerful the Dutch Navy is. They just swept the Swedish Navy right out of the Baltic. The Swedish Navy didn't even want to fight it. When the Dutch sent something like 30 ships to relieve Danzig, which is today Gdansk, just changed the Swedish-Polish War completely on its head, just by sending warships through. And then helped the Swedes in the 1660s. Basically carve out what is today modern Scandinavia. Southern Sweden was part of Denmark. Not after 1658, and definitely not after 1660. So the Dutch could do that. So what we're seeing is the Chinese don't have a response. They don't have a space. And so what's happening is other people are filling that space. And those other people who are filling the space are increasingly more powerful. And they're not going to be pushed aside. And then there's the irony, the ironic. The 400 million people. China is by far the largest, most successful country in the world. It's a continent unto itself. That turned out to be a problem. Now, how? How could that be a problem? That's always a good thing. People are a good thing. Well, it's bad because of the time. Because what is happening in Europe? which has a lot less people, which has maybe 300 million people in all of Europe, spread between all the different countries, is that there's a scientific revolution going on. Because the lack of people in Europe means they need machines, they need science to catch up. Whereas in China, labor was cheap. So your solution to the problem was not to make a machine, it was just to hire more people. You don't need to have a tractor. You just hire 15 more workers. People were cheap. So the economic solution is just to hire more people, which sounds great, except it means there's no industrial or scientific revolution. You don't have to solve your economic problems with knowledge, with efficiency, with industry. Now, that's not a problem as long as no one else has an industrial revolution. And what's the problem? By the 1750s, England is starting one. England is going to have an industrial. Europe has already started its scientific one. You're going to get the steam revolution. Like, the answer was always cheap labor, more people. That's not a bad solution through all of history, right up until 1750. So just when the Chinese don't have a navy, just when the Qing are rich and safe and secure, the world is changing around them. And the stuff that worked for decades, for centuries, for millennia, the rules of the world for 2,000 years no longer worked. They were changing. The thing is that nobody in Beijing really knew. And then the British show up with their guns and their ships, and so the balance shifts. When the British bring their steamships to China and start blowing stuff up, it is a complete change. It blows everybody's mind. Thank you. Be safe. Take care.